Luke Jeffrey Batty was born on June 20th, 2002, to his mother Rosie Batty and his father Greg Anderson in New South Wales. He was an athletic boy who loved playing cricket, bananas, SpongeBob, and the color yellow. When Luke's parents first met, they had been working for a recruitment company, and his mother Rosie quickly became enamored with his father Greg. She thought that Greg was good-looking, tall, well-dressed, and well-spoken. The pair had an on-again, off-again relationship for a couple of years before they lost contact. Then, when they met up again 8 years later, things became serious. Just weeks later, Rosie found out that she was pregnant with their son, Luke. It was from this point that Greg began to display increasingly guarded and aggressive behavior. Soon, he also began speaking about hearing voices. But despite these concerning behaviors, Rosie still really wanted to work things out with the man who was going to be the father of her child. She herself had never planned on having children, so being a single mom was a scary thought. One time after Greg and Rosie had an argument, Greg snuck over to Rosie's home while she was at work. He then took the pair of slippers that she'd bought him and cut them up with some scissors. Greg also went outside and smashed the garden bench that they had renovated together to pieces with an axe. When Luke was born, his mother Rosie had left Greg and she was staying at a Russian Orthodox monastery located in New South Wales. Greg wasn't present for his son's birth, as he'd been banned from the monastery after he'd made abusive phone calls to the mother and son. But shortly after, Rosie would decide to give Greg another chance, and they got back together. From that point on, the father showed his new son nothing but love. He helped care for Luke by bathing him, changing his diapers, and feeding him. But Greg's anger towards Rosie still could not be kept under control. When Rosie was still healing from her C-section, Greg assaulted her for the first time. This caused her to end their relationship yet again, but she still kept in close contact with him, since she wanted Luke to have an active father in his life. Unlike how he was towards her, Greg was good to his son, never getting aggravated with him or even using a harsh tone. By the age of 2, Luke witnessed multiple altercations between his parents, which included a time where Greg picked up a play cart and smashed it on the railing of the staircase. Then he threw a piece of the toy in Rosie's direction. Rosie was holding their son Luke at the time. After that, Greg went over to Rosie and pulled her by the hair. Before he left, Greg told her, "If you ever stop me from seeing Luke, I'll kill you and your animals." The day after this terrifying statement was made, Rosie filed for a restraining order against Greg. But because the father's anger was never directed toward Luke, he was still allowed to continue seeing him. At some point, the restraining order ran out, and when it did, Rosie didn't bother to renew it because he'd ceased his intimidating behavior for a while. Around December of 2005, Rosie moved to the town of Tayab with Luke to be closer to their friends. After that, things were quiet for a time. But when Rosie ended a long-term relationship with another man, in 2012, at the time Luke was 10, Greg swooped back into her life. He attempted to rekindle their relationship and have the three of them become a family once again. However, when Rosie rejected his offer, Greg attacked her. On May 16, 2012, the police were called to Rosie's home after she told them that Greg threatened to hit her with a vase in front of Luke. He would be arrested the same day, but due to multiple delays, he wasn't charged until January of the following year, and the matter never went before a court. A family violence intervention order was also made against Greg. The father had little to do with his son for years, but now that he'd re-entered his life, Greg began taking Rosie through a long custody battle. At the same time, Greg's mental health had been declining even further. He was living out of his car and had been for years. He was also constantly smoking marijuana, and it seemed as if he couldn't get himself out of poverty. Greg had been offered help in the past too, but he always failed to accept it, instead choosing to believe that he was fine. Rosie was positive that Greg had a mental illness at this point, though he was never officially diagnosed with one. According to her, Greg's deluded behavior, sense of grandeur, and his paranoia sabotaged every friendship and relationship that he ever had. It was clear that his life was falling apart, and Rosie believed that Luke was the only bright light that the father had left. Then, on January 3, 2013, Greg broke into Rosie's apartment and he chased her around the home, assaulted her, and threatened to kill her. Luckily, Luke was not present when this happened. Following this, Greg would be arrested, and when he was granted bail, it was on strict conditions, including that he was now banned from going to the suburb of Tayab, which was where Luke was attending his football training. After Greg was arrested, he was placed inside a holding room, where he exhibited rather entitled behavior, telling officers, "I only answer to Jesus. What makes you think you've got a right to hold me at all?"
I intend to interview you in relation to making threats to kill and making threats to inflict serious injury and use unregistered motor vehicle. Before continuing, I must inform you do not have to say or do anything, but anything you say or do may be given in evidence. Do you understand that?
I do. So I don't wish to say anything. Matter's finished. I wish to leave.
Yep, that's your right. I'll just read you this right as well. I must also inform you of your rights. You have the right to communicate with or attempt to communicate with a friend or relative to inform that person of your whereabouts. You have the right to communicate with or attempt to communicate with a legal practitioner. If you are not a citizen or permanent resident of Australia, you have the right to communicate with or attempt to communicate with the consular office of the country of which you are a citizen. Do you understand these rights?
What right do you think you have to hold me for what?
I'll get to that.
What right you've got to have me here at all?
Do you understand the rights that have just been read to you?
I understand what you've read to me. I want to know why you think that you've got a right to hold me at all.
Okay. Do you wish to exercise any of these rights before the interview proceeds?
Well, the interview's finished. I said I do not wish to comment.
Okay.
You have nothing, there is nothing.
Yep.
So let's move on.
In fairness to yourself, I just need to get through these questions and then whatever you want to say after that, we can do that.
I said I don't wish to say anything, so how can there be questions and answers? You're now insulting my right of intelligence. Right? And you're denying my right to legally represent myself by saying I do not wish to answer them. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?
No, I don't. I'm not denying you a right, that's why I'm asking.
You've denied me because I told you I do not wish to answer anything.
Yep.
That's right. Now you're going to ask me a list of questions.
Yep.
You've denied me the right.
Okay. So at this point in time, do you wish to exercise the right to call a lawyer or friend or relative? No.
I wish to leave. You have nothing, I wish to leave. You've arrested me before, it's gone through the court, you've had nothing. You've got the same person lying again.
Yep. All right, we'll just back up a bit. What's your age and date of birth?
You still have that information from before.
Yep.
It's on my driver's licence. You're asking me questions are there. And I said I would not ask questions, and you're still firing at me. You again have not exercised the right that you asked in the beginning that I could have.
Yep.
You're denying me my right by asking me my questions. Top hand, constable.
Okay.
In the name of Jesus Christ you are.
If I say to you your date of birth is the 3rd of November 1959, would you agree? The allegation is that on approximately 13:45 of the 3rd of the 1st 2013, okay. I'm going to suspend the interview at this time due to no participation from the accused.
Now, Rosie never thought that Greg would hurt Luke. He'd never been verbally or physically abusive towards him, so she allowed her son to keep seeing his father. Then, one day in April of 2013, Luke came home from seeing his father, and he told his mother about a very disturbing conversation he had with Greg. The distraught boy said that his father had been holding a knife while they were driving in the car together, and Greg told him, "It could all end with this." This incident rightly alarmed Luke's mother, and she was able to get a no-contact order issued between her and Greg. This, however, did not prevent Luke's father from attending his son's football and other sporting events, as it was agreed that there was less risk out in public. So on February 12, 2014, Greg showed up to one of Luke's cricket practices. The little boy had been worried about his father coming that day because he didn't think that Greg was very happy. However, when Greg arrived, he seemed to be in a good mood and quite relaxed. Rosie was happy to see him participating in their son's training session. At the end of practice, when it was time to go home for the evening, Luke begged for just a few more minutes with his father. The other children had already started leaving, but since Luke didn't get to see Greg much, Rosie told her son that was fine, seeing no problem with the request. Rosie hung back while Luke and Greg walked towards the nets where they began playing cricket together. The mother was looking down at her phone when she suddenly heard a terrible sound. Immediately, Rosie began to run towards her son, and she saw him lying on the ground. Greg was kneeling beside him. At first, she thought that Greg had just accidentally bowled a ball too fast, and it hit Luke in the head, knocking him out. But when one of the coaches rushed to help with the situation, Greg told him, "He's fine, he's in heaven now." Greg had deliberately hit Luke in the head with a cricket bat and then proceeded to stab him in the neck with a knife. When Rosie saw her son, she tried to call an ambulance, but the call wouldn't connect, and she frantically started running and screaming for someone to call an ambulance. She still believed that it had been a terrible accident and that Greg's anguish was because he'd accidentally hurt his son. It was only later that Rosie realized that what happened to Luke was not an accident. When emergency responders arrived on the scene, Greg threatened them with a knife and they tried to subdue him with pepper spray, but that did not work. Ultimately, they had to shoot him, and he later died of his injuries. Greg intentionally prevented paramedics from accessing his son Luke, and once they were finally able to get to him, after Greg had been shot, the 11-year-old was pronounced dead. Multiple young children had witnessed the ordeal, and they later told police that they'd seen Greg intentionally and repeatedly hitting Luke with a bat. He then pulled out a knife and stabbed his son to death. Luke died from multiple massive head injuries. Rosie believed that Greg planned Luke's death and he'd chosen to kill him, not because he truly disliked his son, but because it was a revenge tactic against her. She would say, "Can you imagine what that feels like? That someone against all odds wants to make you suffer for the rest of your life. To win?" Following Luke's death, it was discovered that Greg had previously threatened his roommate with cutting his head off. Following this, he was arrested by police for looking at child pornography on computers in a public library. Greg also often heard voices, was obsessive with religion, often prayed out loud, had hallucinations, and often showed cold behavior. Once, Greg even threatened Luke's football coach, telling him, "I have a knife with your name on it." Apparently, Greg had been in contact with police just 3 weeks prior to Luke's death, but the officers who'd spoken to him failed to execute warrants issued for his arrest because he did not know about their existence. Rosie was never initially informed of Greg's arrest for CP, and she was unaware of the death threat that he'd made to his roommate, even after police called her to ask where Greg was living. Also, at the time of Luke's death, his father was facing 11 criminal charges and was subject to 4 unexecuted arrest warrants. Rosie considered calling the police when she'd seen Greg earlier, the same day that he'd killed Luke, knowing he had a number of outstanding warrants for his arrest, mostly related to threats he made against her. But she decided not to, for Luke's sake, since she had done so on 2 previous occasions, and it had been very traumatic, stressful, unpredictable for him. Greg avoided arrest for so long because he was homeless and difficult to track down, and when he learned that a bench warrant had been issued against him for being in contempt of court, he knew of a glitch in the legal system that meant he no longer had to report to police for bail, enabling him to avoid arrest. Following Luke's death, an inquest was held to determine what went wrong with the systems that should have protected him. Could the police, the courts, and child protection services have acted differently or cooperated more fully? At the end of the inquest, it was found that no one person or agency could have reasonably been expected to foresee that Greg would be a rare perpetrator and Luke, a rare victim of a violent filicide. Shortly after losing her son, Rosie bravely spoke to the media to talk about the reality of domestic violence in society and has been an ambassador ever since. Just weeks after Luke's death, Rosie started the Luke Batty Foundation and was also later awarded Australian of the Year in 2015. Rosie said about her son, "Luke was nearly as tall as me. He was sensitive. He enjoyed his footy. He enjoyed his cricket. He was effervescent. He was funny. He wasn't the best scholar, but he was intelligent. He enjoyed his school." She said that Luke loved his father and felt pain because he knew he was struggling. Rosie continued, "He was a little boy in a growing body that felt pain and sadness and fear for his mom, and he always believed he would be safe with his dad." On the night of February 13th, 2014, many people attended a candlelit vigil at the sports ground where Luke died. Luke's funeral was then held on February 20th, 2014. Hundreds of people, including the 11-year-old's family, friends, and schoolmates, went to Flinders Christian Community College to pay their respects. Luke's yellow coffin was adorned with bright flowers and a stuffed SpongeBob SquarePants toy.